Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar titled Sub-Saharan Africa, Another Shock and Little Room to Maneuver. This title has been taken from the latest Regional Outlook report released by the International Monetary Fund, which is better known by its acronym IMF. For those of you who do not know this already, IMF is a multilateral lending agency to which sovereign governments often turn to in times of severe financial crisis, especially when confronted with balance of payments problems. Something that we've seen most recently play out in Sri Lanka. But we are not here to talk about Sri Lanka. We are here to find out the economic impact, the economic outlook that the IMF has laid out for Sub-Saharan Africa in its recent report. We have with us here Hany Abdel-Latif, economist at the IMF, who is the co-author of the Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa, and he is part of a team led by Peter Kovacs. So let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, the economic recovery made by Sub-Saharan Africa last year surprised the world. The region was struggling to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Infection rates were high, vaccines were in short supply, much of the population remained unvaccinated, small businesses faced ruin, urban centers were in lockdown, and the little health infrastructure that did exist was pushed to breaking point. But Sub-Saharan Africa showed itself to be remarkably resilient. Its economic performance belied all expectations, so much so that the IMF revised the GDP growth figures for 2021 from 3.7% to 4.5%. This year, however, that progress has been jeopardized by rising food prices and inflation. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has delivered yet another shock to the region, that from which it may be more difficult to bounce back. I'm Amit Jain, the director of the NTU-SBF Center for African Studies at the Nanyang Business School in Singapore. And I'm pleased to welcome Hany Abdel-Latif of the International Monetary Fund. Hany, welcome. The IMF report says the Sub-Saharan Africa faces new shocks, but has fewer options. How so?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Professor Amit Jain and colleagues in the Center for African Studies for inviting me to present the Regional Economic Outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. The report, which was released in April, covers a wide range of timely and important topics. In today's presentation, I will focus on a few points. In particular, the presentation will shed light on 3 spillover channels through which the war in Ukraine affects Sub-Saharan Africa, 3 immediate policy priorities to maintain stability over the short term, and 3 essential economic reforms to create jobs and meet development objectives. And then finally, I will touch upon the role of international community in supporting recovery and building resilience in Sub-Saharan Africa. So, starting with the 3 channels through which the war in Ukraine affects Sub-Saharan Africa, we know that the war in Ukraine poses another major challenge for the region, compounding the already severe economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you all aware, these consequences include a markedly lower output path, reversal in development gains, and elevated macroeconomic imbalances, including heightened debt vulnerabilities. So while direct trade and financial linkages between Russia, Ukraine, and most of sub-Saharan African countries are relatively modest, the economic implications of this war, like the pandemic, are likely to be felt most strongly in sub-Saharan Africa. An important reason for this is that many countries in the region have limited room to cushion such large adverse exogenous shocks. As elsewhere, there are 3 key channels through which the impact of the war is being felt in the region. 1 is in energy prices, 2 through food prices, and 3 is the through financial global financial conditions. So, as mentioned earlier, Sub-Saharan Africa's direct links with Russia and Ukraine are limited, making up less than 2.5% of the region's total trade with the outside world. However, The war in Ukraine has increased prices for key commodities, and therefore the war will affect the region through its effect on global commodity prices. But the effects are not uniform across countries. For the region's 8 net oil exporters, higher energy prices will present a windfall gain. Exporters of other commodities, copper, gold, diamond, may also benefit from higher prices and increased sales. But for the remaining 37 non-oil exporting countries, higher oil and gas prices will result in a significant terms of trade shock, which will worsen trade balances. It will also result in a significant pressure on prices and erode standards of living and weaken physical balances, particularly in those countries that seek to delay the fuel price increase passed through to consumers, mainly countries with fuel subsidies. For oil importers, the crisis is expected to increase the region's import bill by almost $19 billion. In addition, oil importing fragile countries are expected to experience about 0.8% deterioration of their fiscal balances, which is twice the average of all oil importing countries. So this is the first channel. So the second channel through which the war affects Sub-Saharan Africa, obviously through its effect on food prices. So an extended conflict could further drive up global food prices. And this is a particular concern for Sub-Saharan Africa, which is the most food insecure region in the world. High food prices will hurt the vulnerable most. Even before the war in Ukraine, Sub-Saharan Africa faced severe food insecurity, much more than in other regions. I think there's a chart on the right-hand side here on this slide show clearly that in 2019, even before the war, before the pandemic, about 57.7% of Sub-Saharan Africa population were facing moderate or severe food insecurity. And that's compared to 23.6% in other emerging markets and developing countries. So the food insecurity is a very prevalent or something that's high concern in Sub-Saharan Africa. So we know that Sub-Saharan Africa imports around about 85% of the wheat it consumes, of which Russia and Ukraine account for around 1/3. So with food representing a high share of the consumption basket in the region than elsewhere, the impact of rising global food prices, which are now at their highest level in over a decade, is said to be highly consequential and obviously will harm the poor, the most. So this is the second channel through which the war in Ukraine is affected or is expected to affect Sub-Saharan Africa. The third channel, as I said, so we're talking about 3 channels here. The third channel is the effect through global financial condition. Even before the war in Ukraine, inflationary pressures in the world's major advanced economies were higher and more persistent than anticipated. With rising commodity and food prices only acting as a catalyst, advanced economies will likely tighten monetary policy at a faster rate than anticipated a few months ago. So with worsening geopolitical tensions, a key concern is the prospect of rising and volatile risk premia, which may undermine portfolio inflows to the region and place added downward pressure on exchange rates. Also, Sub-Saharan Africa will face headwinds from lower demand from key trading partners because of global activity slowdown. So these are 3 channels through which the war in Ukraine is expected to affect Sub-Saharan Africa. Now moving to talk about the regional outlook, which became more complicated. We have a shock on top of a shock. So we have the pandemic and then followed by the war in Ukraine. So due to such a murky and highly uncertain global situation, the regional outlook became more challenging with the balance of risks skewed to the downside. And of course, the fallout from the crisis will be far from equal. Across countries, the effects of the war in Ukraine are not uniform, and also within countries, the war may compound pre-existing inequalities and social discontent arising from the ongoing pandemic. So when we talk about growth projection for Sub-Saharan Africa, projected real GDP growth in Sub-Saharan Africa for 2021 has been revised upward, as Amit just mentioned before during the introduction. The IMF revised it upward from 3.7 to 4.5%. However, the war interrupted the region's recovery. Overall economic activity in 2022 is expected to slow to 3.8%, down from, of course, 4.5% in 2021. But this masks significant heterogeneity across the region and mainly reflects weaker growth prospects for oil importing countries due to the oil price shock following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Growth for oil exporter countries in 2022 have been revised up by 0.8 percentage point compared to the October 2021 forecast. Although security challenges and aging infrastructure constrain oil supply. On the other hand, growth prospects for oil importers have deteriorated with downward revisions of 0.4 percentage points. The commodity price shock is also having highly asymmetric effects on government revenue and fiscal balances across the region. In oil exporting countries, 2022 fiscal revenues have been revised up by 2.1 percentage points of GDP. Exporters of other commodities are also expected to receive revenue gains, though they are more modest. But the impact of these gains on fiscal balances, even in oil exporting countries, is much more muted because of high expenditures on energy subsidies. On the other hand, of course, non-resource intensive countries will see their fiscal balances deteriorate considerably. So that's talking about the economic outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. Also, in addition to elevated geopolitical risk abroad, Sub-Saharan Africa has experienced an increase in the prevalence of political instability and military coups in recent years. Since August 2020, military forces have assumed control in 4 countries, while coups have been attempted in another 2. So regional and international sanctions have been imposed on several of these countries, constraining their access to finance and curtailing their growth prospects. So the region is also confronting several armed conflicts and terrorist threats, including in Ethiopia, Nigeria, and elsewhere, and other countries as well. So this is again another factor that may complicate the regional outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa. The third factor, of course, the pandemic is still there. This all happening while all countries have been trying to find their way through a prolonged pandemic with an inadequate vaccination rate. The region remains exposed to new COVID-19 waves. But even before the pandemic, Sub-Saharan Africa struggled to create job opportunities for its growing workforce. But COVID-19 has further undermined labor markets, especially in contact-intensive sectors, which employ relatively more vulnerable groups, including women and low-skilled workers. So as a result, a long-term trend of decreasing poverty that had previously taken hold in the region has reversed, with 39 million more people falling into extreme poverty in 2020 and 2021. Of course, the sharp increase in food prices due to the war in Ukraine has also the potential to further increase poverty across the region. And the pandemic has also harmed much needed human capital due to prolonged school closures, which will further widen the gap in learning outcomes and weigh on medium-term growth. So these are 3 factors that make the the outlook for Sub-Saharan Africa more complex. So moving from here to the policy priorities. Now, when we talk about policy priorities, we have covered the main channels through which the war in Ukraine affects Sub-Saharan Africa. And also we have shed light on how complex the regional outlook has become. Now we turn to policy priorities. Of course, policymakers in the region are facing complex choices with fewer options. On the health side, as before, the region needs to accelerate its vaccination campaigns to contain the risks of new COVID-19 waves and the emergence of new variants. Supply constraints have eased somewhat toward the end of 2021, thanks to donations by advanced economists channeled via COVAX and the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust. But on the other side, when we talk about the economic side or economic policy, then besides controlling the pandemic, the region faces three pressing policy priorities. One is addressing the economic impact of the war in Ukraine without adding to debt vulnerabilities. Two, balancing inflation versus growth. Three, managing exchange rate adjustment. So these are the three policy priorities, which I will cover in the next few minutes. So looking at the first policy priority here, which is reducing debt vulnerabilities or addressing the economic impact of the war without adding to debt vulnerabilities, Sub-Saharan Africa's public debt has increased steadily for more than a decade. Of course, this helped fund the region's development needs, but it is now placing severe strains on debt sustainability in many countries. On the other hand, the pandemic has worsened most countries' fiscal position, pushing public debt to its highest level since the beginning of the century. For example, one half of low-income countries in the region are in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And many have been left with little or no fiscal space at a time of elevated spending needs. Also, the composition of creditors has also changed, reflecting growing share of private creditors in public debt due to the region's deepening of financial markets and improved access to international markets. Of course, access to domestic and foreign private markets present both opportunities and challenges. So the ability to borrow domestically, of course, was particularly helpful at the beginning of the pandemic when many sub-Saharan African countries lost access to international financial markets. However, borrowing domestically or domestic borrowing could also limit it also has like domestic maturities are usually relatively short and interest rate is usually higher. So that is the challenge here when you have a higher share of domestic or private creditors. So when we look at or having greater access to international market, again, will also offer or give access to much needed financial resources. But again, the substitution of low-cost, long-term multilateral flows with higher-cost private funds has resulted in a steep rise in external debt service costs and higher rollover risks. So this is when we talk about this point here. This is the first policy priority. Actually, sorry, I actually jumped this one slide. So one is basically to address the impact of the war in Ukraine without adding to debt vulnerability. Two, the second point is balancing inflation and growth. So there are three policy priorities as we highlighted. So one, addressing the impact of the war without adding to debt vulnerability. Two, balancing inflation and growth. And three is managing exchange rate adjustment. So moving to the second point. So most countries in the region have seen significant inflationary pressures over the past year, affecting both food items, which is about 40% of the consumption basket, and also non-food items. Factors contributing to this include high commodity prices, droughts, and export restrictions in major food exporters, and the global supply shortages. The war in Ukraine has exacerbated these pressures through even higher oil and food prices, particularly of wheat in several countries. Higher oil prices have helped ease exchange rate pressures and associated inflation in oil exporters, while pushing up energy prices and inflation in oil importers. So, of course, the escalation of the war in Ukraine can also push oil and food prices even higher, and faster than anticipated monetary policy normalization in the United States and Europe could lead to stronger exchange rate pressures that would fuel inflation in Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the second point. So the third policy priority, which basically managing exchange rate pressures. The COVID-19 has generally weakened the region's exchange rates. During the first year and a half of the pandemic, exchange rates depreciated on average by about 10% against the US dollar. In line with elevated risk aversion and volatile commodity prices and capital flows. For Sub-Saharan Africa, half of the region's economies maintain a pegged exchange rate arrangement, and the other half maintain more flexible arrangements. Intervention is relatively common in the later countries, with a trend toward more managed frameworks in the years since the global financial crisis. So the advice here would be, in countries with a pegged exchange rate policy, will need to find the right balance, the right policy mix that is consistent with the maintaining the credibility of the peg. And for the other half that have more flexible exchange rate arrangement, some additional depreciation may help buffer the effects of global financial tightening, but the benefits of flexibility are often or depend on, of course, like there's limit to how much this can help cushion the shock. So now these are the three priorities. So we covered the three priorities. We covered also the three channels through which the war in Ukraine affect Sub-Saharan Africa. Let me now move to the last point in my presentation, which cover the three essential reforms over the medium term. So looking beyond the pandemic and current geopolitical tensions, creating jobs and meeting development objectives will require decisive action. So the three reforms, essential reforms that are included in this report, one is to do with the energy transition, two is about diversification, the last one, or the third one, is boosting private investment. So let me briefly cover these 3 points. So when we talk about cleaner, greener growth, so that we're looking at managing the energy transition and addressing and also addressing the climate change issues. Okay, so now we're looking not at the immediate policy priorities, but we're looking at a longer horizon. So we look at medium term, we need to address these sort of issues. Addressing the challenges posed by climate change will require investing in adaptation and seizing the opportunities offered by the energy transition. The second point, or the second policy, or essential reform that we propose in this report is promoting diversification. Enhancing economic diversification is important to boost resilience and growth, especially in commodity exporting countries. Reliance on commodity exports makes countries highly susceptible to fluctuations in commodity prices. Also, resource-intensive countries suffer from significantly weaker economic growth when we look at historical data. So this is the second policy or essential reform that is proposed in this report. The third point, or the third essential reform that we suggest in this report is to do with the private investment and supporting the private sector. So leveraging the private sector's potential through regional trade integration. We all know about the African Continental Free Trade Area, which can boost the productivity of its economies. And also it could increase market efficiency and reduce the cost of doing business, etc. So it's over lots of opportunities. Also, boosting private investment through innovation or innovative channels. So that could be through promoting digital innovation. And we saw that digitalization can promote financial inclusions, digitalization, during the COVID-19 restrictions, how online shopping, entertainment, virtual meetings and events like this have become very common everywhere. So this could be like another way for boosting private investment is through pushing digitalization forward. So these are the three policy or the three essential reforms that we propose. And finally, as I said, I will end up with the talking briefly about the role of the international community. So the international community must step up to ease the food security crisis. In a recent statement, the IMF called for emergency food supplies, financial support, including grants, increased agricultural production, and unhindered trade, among other measures. The IMF is committed to ensuring that most vulnerable members receive adequate financial support. We saw last year's SDR allocation was particularly useful for the region's most vulnerable economies, and rechanneling of SDRs to countries with weaker fundamental will support the region's resilience. So another issue, one final issue, need to be supported within the international community. Some countries may need to restore debt sustainability, which will acquire debt reprofiling and restructuring of their public debt. And then to make this reality, then the G20 common framework need to better define its debt restructuring process and timeline, and we need to push forward in that direction. So with this, I think I will stop here. I will conclude my presentation. I think I have 2 minutes, so I finished 2 minutes early, but obviously that will give more time for discussion. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to engage with your questions.
Thank you so much, Hany, for that rather insightful presentation. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, there is a lot that is to digest here.
Okay, I just want to say that Peter joined us, Amit, so he can join the panelist if that's okay.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful, Peter. Welcome.
Yeah, he's been in the presentation from the beginning, but I actually didn't notice him. Okay,
Peter Kovacs is the economist from the IMF who led the report that Hany just presented. I just wanted to let all of you know that you are welcome to ask questions. Send a note to me or to Boxy here in the chat box. Ask for unmuting yourself, and she'll let you in. Before you can gather your thoughts and consolidate those questions, Hany, what I found really interesting in your report is that the IMF has recommended fiscal consolidation for most Sub-Saharan African countries. And what that really means is improving the revenue mobilization, expanding the tax base, improving the collection. Do they really have the necessary conditions within their Ministry of Finance and others to be able to do that in these circumstances. You've also said, fiscal policy needs to be carefully targeted to protecting the households. Many of these countries really don't have the capacity to be able to do that or to manage their debt sustainability. The only way that one can think of them being able to do that is to rely a lot more on donors and international partners to do so. Do you see any evidence of that kind of a help coming to most of the Sub-Saharan African countries?
Yeah, I think that's true. Like the idea is that, okay, so and I think this has been highlighted in the report, that this shock or the region has been facing a shock on top of a shock. So they already run out of space, like physical space, to cushion shocks, and that's why shocks to the region are more are felt the most because of the absence of such cushion to deal with or to address exogenous shocks. So I think, as you already mentioned, that the IMF basically recommend that targeted and direct transfers to vulnerable households are the most desirable response. But we know that this might not be visible in all countries, as you just highlighted, because basically this is not they don't have the space, the fiscal space to do so. So also there's if we're gonna choose the second best policy response, probably would be well-designed and temporary targeted tax reductions and price subsidies. Again, this is the second best, but this has to be well-designed and temporary. And as you highlighted, it has to be very done in a very targeted way, and not just across the board. In terms of support, the last part of the report already highlight that. Okay, we talked about the SDR allocation and how that helped relieve the pressure in the region, but also the initiative to rechannel some of this SDR from countries that have a relatively stronger economic position, to those who are most or need this the most. I think the commitment is about 100 million.
Would you mind, Hany, would you mind explaining to our participants here what the special drawing rights are in a layman's language, and perhaps also talk about the common framework which the IMF has called on the international community to put in place fairly to remove actually for efficient debt restructure.
Okay, I think well, I'll talk about the first one, and I probably will invite Peter to cover the second part because he's the expert in this. But let me just summarize first the first part, or respond to the first part of your question. The SDR is an international reserve asset created by the IMF to supplement the official reserves of its member countries. So it's not a currency. It is a potential claim on the freely usable currencies of IMF members. As such, SDRs can, or special drawing rights, can provide a country with liquidity. So a basket of currencies define the SDR. So when a country in need, when there is a shock, and the country need to cushion that, or so they come to the IMF and they can actually use that. So it basically provides extra liquidity to member countries. In terms of the common framework, Peter, would you like to say any words about explaining the common framework? I think he can use the mic, or not? No. Just give me a moment. While Boxy, could you allow Peter to permit him to talk, please?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Hi. Sorry, it took a few seconds to join. Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Peter Kovacs again. I also worked on this report. So on the common framework, this is an initiative of the G20, the group of 20 advanced economies, to facilitate the process of debt restructuring for countries that need it. I don't know if you have heard, probably you have heard about the Paris Club, which was in place before. So it was a group of creditor countries joining in a process to facilitate that restructuring, and this has also led to the HIPC process almost 20 years ago. So many African countries received debt relief through the HIPC process. With the evolution of the creditor composition in the last 20 years, the Paris Club became a bit less relevant because some emerging creditors such as China and India were not part of the Paris Club. So the international community recognized that a change is needed in order to facilitate future debt restructurings. The good news is that during the pandemic, actually in 2020, the international community in the context of the G20 agreed on the common framework for debt treatment, and new creditors such as China, India, and Saudi Arabia are part of that structure. So they also joined. The common framework are based on very similar principles as the Paris Club. A group of official creditors start to agree on debt restructuring terms with the country, but it also contains comparability of treatment principle with other creditors. So in principle, the private sector creditors are also expected to join the agreement that is reached under the common framework and provide the same terms of debt relief as agreed within the common framework and with the debtor country. So far, the implementation of the common framework has been suffering with certain constraints. 3 countries from Sub-Saharan Africa have applied to the common framework during 2021. This is Ethiopia, Zambia, and Chad. But at the moment, the results are not yet, conclusive. So negotiations have been have started between creditors and the debtor countries. There have been certain creditor committees set up. There have been some progress, but it's much less progress that we had hoped for. So what we recommend in the report is the common framework should be pushed a bit more forward, in particular strengthening processes, setting deadlines, strengthening the comparability of treatment principles, defining how the private sector is expected to participate and so on. So we are still hoping that this would happen because we think that certain countries in Sub-Saharan Africa will need debt restructuring in order to regain that sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. So we've started to get questions.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
Because we talked about international support. I think I'm not sure, Peter, if you talk about the debt suspension, the DSSI. At the beginning of the pandemic, also the G20 put in place this plan to temporarily pause official debt payments to the poorest countries. So, and of course that came to end now, and that's why we need to push forward the G20 common framework. So yeah, I mean that's the only point I wanted to add. Sorry, Peter, if you already covered that, I probably wasn't.
No, not at all. Thank you so much,
Okay.
gentlemen. That was very useful. We have started to receive questions now from the audience, the participants, and I'm glad to see our research fellow Muazu Ibrahim putting up a question for you. Muazu, instead of the chat box, why don't you come in on your talk? Just will allow you to talk and come in and pose your question on the video, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Mazu, we can.
Excellent. This is an excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Hany. And I'm really enjoying this current presentation. Just a quick one, and I'm just relating this to COVID, and of course with Ukraine, Russia invasion having been one of the key exogenous shocks countries are facing, and I'm particularly going to situate it within the context of Sub-Saharan Africa. We've seen countries actually responding to COVID shocks, by providing some fiscal stimulus and of course some form of monetary loosening, where policy rates were actually lowered. And just linking it to the current context, and I'm just going to ask a key question: that at what point should countries actually pull back on their fiscal stimulus, or at what point should countries either strengthen or tighten or actually lose their monetary policy to support our recovery? Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's actually an excellent question and a very hard one as well, because well, we know that the pandemic and the war have placed huge pressure on fiscal balances, and what we are recommending in the report is basically it's important to address these impacts without adding to debt vulnerabilities. So we having debt sustainability in mind. So this is something we need to maintain, and we understand that the shock effect on countries will be different. There's lots of heterogeneity in the region. So we usually group countries depending on the nature of the economies or the structure of the economies. So we look at net commodity importers. These will face strong pressure on fiscal balances. And again, to address that without adding to debt, it's very important to respond in a very targeted manner. So targeted transfers and subsidies. But to do that, I think it's important for these countries to, given that their fiscal space is very limited, then it's very important to reprioritize spending, by example, by cutting non-essential expenditures such as subsidies to state-owned enterprises, and of course, fiscal adjustment will be stronger, or will need to be stronger in countries facing tighter financial constraints. So going back to your question about monetary policy as well. So this is again something we covered, and this is when we discussed the idea of balancing, or trying to hit that balance between controlling inflation and also keeping the supporting the recovery. It's a very, very hard one, because on one side you might be forced to tighten monetary policy just because inflation is going is really high, and on the other side you still want the policy to be more loose to support growth, especially coming out of a pandemic and also now facing another shock. So I think in that case it's very important to on the fiscal side to respond in a very targeted way. We talked about targeted transfers, and if that's not possible, subsidies. But again, these need to be well-designed and temporary measures. Again, the reason here is that because we know that fiscal space is limited, but also debt is very concerning in the region. On the monetary side, again, it's some countries already had to do that. So some countries find themselves forced to increase rates or push interest rates higher just to control inflation, even though this is the time when they need to support the recovery. So it's the advice will be different from one country to another, and it depends on the situation of the country. So moving to the other group, like net commodity exporters, we know that this terms of trade shock represent fiscal windfalls, fiscal gains. So, but only, I mean, this would work only if they contain subsidy expenditures. And I think this is one of the points raised in the report, that even in that case, or even for this group of countries that's supposed to be in a better position, well, relatively compared to others, because they are commodity exporters, and now given higher commodity prices, they should feel some relief. They should have some relief from receiving these fiscal windfalls. But again, without containing subsidy expenditures, that might not be possible. So for example, some oil exporters provide very expensive and generalized energy subsidies to the domestic population. Of course, that could lead to deterioration in fiscal balances, despite the revenue increase associated with higher export prices. So again, removing these generalized subsidies is very crucial, is very important to ensure that the rise in commodity prices will generate fiscal savings. So as I said, so the response to your question will depend on the country situation, but generally when we talk in the report, we group countries depending on the nature or the structure of their economies, and we give the advice based on that. So as I mentioned, so at least I cover two groups of countries now: net commodity importers and net commodity exporters. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have Saki Kobayashi on the line. She has a question for you, Hany.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Excellent insight. My name is Saki Kobayashi. I'm a serial entrepreneur based in Singapore. And so sorry, my baby's crying. Okay, so my question is, you mentioned one of the three essential reforms was energy transition. And I'd like to ask more about Africa's transition to renewable energy. African governments, I'm sure, have been discussing and planning their transition to renewable energy since before COVID and even before Russian invasion of Ukraine. But do you see any of their policies and goals changing? And if the private sector is to engage in Africa's transition to renewable energy, what should we be aware of? And I'm so sorry about my baby crying.
That's perfectly all right. The times we live in, Saki-san.
I think it's just maybe she wants to sleep now. Okay, let me talk about this for a bit. Yeah, we know that African countries have so much potential in terms of renewables, and the transition or the energy transition offer opportunities for Africa. And I think one important or one key challenge here is funding. So you talked about how can the private sector, how the international community can support this transition in Africa. Yes, that is a very important role for these parties to play in supporting Africa transition toward cleaner, greener energy. So, but the main challenge here will be the funding, as we said, and of course this is something that Africa cannot do on its own. So they will need support from the international community. So that means, yes, the private sector, international community or international organization will have to step up to support Africa's efforts toward energy transition. And Peter may be able to add a few more comments on that.
Yes. So basically, what we are suggesting in the report is that besides, it's very important that Africa is starting on this road of energy transition, and this is clearly acknowledged that the region has huge potential. But we are also saying that it needs to be a just energy transition, meaning that the removal of fossil fuel subsidies or the introduction of carbon taxes or such measures do not pose affordability challenges for the most vulnerable segments of the population. We have to remember that access to electricity in Africa is still, constrained to many people. They still don't have access. So it's very important that this access to electricity or the extension of access continues even as the energy transition unfolds. And in terms of private investors, we are talking about different measures that can be taken to make these private investments in infrastructure more attractive. Multilateral institutions, other bilateral donors have different programs to do that. For example, blending or guarantee programs that would improve the risk-return profile for private investors. I think a lot of these institutions have tried to embark on these instruments to attract private investment. This is highly relevant in the energy sector because the risk-return profile in the energy sector is relatively good already. So just a little push from public funding could really attract much more private finance, especially in countries which have already fairly developed financial markets in the continent, such as Kenya, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and countries like that that have a larger market, more developed financial system. We think that in the energy sector there is a huge potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. If I may, the way I interpret some of the recommendations that you've made is clearly governments are likely to be spending a lot more on social welfare and protection of the vulnerable. And that means taking away capital away from things like infrastructure building, which is also required for sustainable growth. So it's a catch-22 kind of a situation. So if I'm an investor sitting here in Singapore interested in investing in these sectors, what are those signals that I should be looking at to figure out what markets are more attractive than others?
I think that's a very good question because, as we said, it's very like it's one region, but it's like there's lots of heterogeneities out there. But I think let me just split your question into two parts. So the first part, yes, it's kind of there are lots of trade-offs. So with limited fiscal space, then these countries need to prioritize their spending and also think about, as we said, generalized approach to provide subsidies, etc. So that's kind of on the saving side. So in terms of what they need to cut, what they need to push, I think in one important point here is that these countries need to invest in their or improve their social security net, because social safety net, because in time of shocks like this now, it's very difficult to shield the whole community or the whole population from higher prices. But what we recommend is basically let that pass through, but then you need to expand your social safety net to support the most vulnerable. So basically, you become more like focused on those who are most affected by the shock. So that is on the physical side. So definitely there are trade-offs, and these has to be taken into consideration when designing, physical responses or economic policy in general. So just moving to the next part of the question, which is which countries to invest. I think it's very or Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa has so much potential in terms of the risk reward or what they can offer. One area we just mentioned is the energy transition. All these countries have so much potential in terms of renewable energy, etc. So there are different areas to offer opportunities in Sub-Saharan Africa. But I think also in the idea what investors when they look at where to invest, I think it will depend on their risk appetite, I think, and there are so many factors that can go under that. So on top of my mind, I cannot say investors, or I cannot say I recommend investors go to country A and don't go to country B, because this is it's not my role, first of all, but the second, I think it will be different for each investor what they're looking for. You always weigh the risk and reward, and from what we've seen, we covered in the report that how Africa, or how much Africa can offer opportunities as well. But I think one major or one important thing that we need to consider, or African countries need to consider, which the policies were recommended and also the reforms that were recommended in the report. I think working on diversification, working on managing the energy transition, working on improving investment climate, that will encourage more investment, that will attract more investment to Africa. So what I am talking about here is that what should policymakers do to make Africa more attractive? So these are essential reforms that we covered in the report. Obviously, diversification, try to win their economies from being dependent on commodity, etc. So these are from the policymaker side. So this is what the report highlights in more detail, like what policymakers should focus on in the short term. So these are the policy priorities, and also in on the medium term, what essential reforms that are needed. But again, given the situation, it's always easy to say, but of course it's really there will be so many trade-offs, and these need to be considered based on the country circumstances. I'll stop here.
We are coming to an end now, but before I close, there is one question that has been posted by an anonymous attendee. In your opinion, what do you think are the sectors that are key for economic recovery of Sub-Saharan Africa in general? If you can identify maybe one or two, that would be excellent. You're on mute.
Sorry, I was just saying, again, it's really hard to put it's not like one size fits all. So it's very difficult to, we have 45 countries in the region. So it's very hard to point at one sector over another. But from what we've seen so far, there is a big push toward digitalization and sectors like the use of innovative solutions, like what happened during the pandemic, etc. So I think these are very promising areas, but again, I find it hard to point out one or two sector that will apply to all 45 countries. So it's really hard to get that. But I think from my point of view is that there are ways, or there are digitalization is kind of provide solutions, support, again, the private sector, but policymakers also need, or these governments or these countries need to invest also in the infrastructure. But then I think Peter highlighted that at some point that given that the limited physical space they have, there is room for private investors to contribute and also to gain from that, because the opportunities these countries offer are massive. And I don't know if Peter would like to add anything in terms of what sectors. I find it really hard to point one or two sectors, but maybe Peter might be able to add something more useful to those who ask the question they want to invest.
I just wanted to, yeah, if I may, I just wanted to, I mean, in terms of the sectors, what we've seen is that there has been really a setback for human capital development in the continent during the pandemic. You've seen that school closures were much more prevalent in the region. And on average, schools were closed about 130 days during the pandemic, as opposed to around 80 days in advanced economies. Also, you know, there's a much higher share of young school-age population in these countries. And also the digital technology that would have allowed remote learning is not present in many countries. So we think that a push in education to recoup some of these losses, learning losses, will be critical for all the sectors basically, and the overall investment climate in the continent. So there's a need for a massive investment push in education. Otherwise, you know, these learning losses would never be recovered, and that this would have an effect in almost every sector of the economy. And you know, because our report really didn't have the space to go into specific sectors, but without going to specific sectors, I think this is what I would highlight the most for investors. Thank you.
I think also, Peter, renewables, like, you know, the private sector contribution, as you mentioned earlier, is also important. I don't know, I'm just trying to point out some areas, like we know that these are not expensive, but they have high installation cost, and that's why we need to, or these countries need finance, and that is the funding these sort of transition is very challenging. And I think there are lots of opportunities there for the private sector. And I think that could be a very attractive, you know, private, for private investors. I'm talking about the renewable sector in Africa.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. We have exceeded our time for the webinar today, but just about with that, before I come to a closing, at least if there is a silver lining to all of this, is that your expectation for next year, 2023, is slightly better, and I hope Africa will surprise us once again by performing better than what you have you know, forecasted to be. So with that hope, thank you, gentlemen, for all your presentation. Hany, Peter Kovacs, and wherever you are who are attending this webinar, have a wonderful day ahead, or the evening. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much
for joining.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. Bye.